Good afternoon, and welcome to this Politico Live event on sustainable and green gases and the future of Europe's gas grid. I'm Hernandez, energy policy reporter at Politico Europe. And if you're watching this, you already probably know a little bit about today's sustainable fuels, made from animal manure, corn husks, even the stuff in your local sewer. You probably also know a little about the green gases of tomorrow, like ammonia and hydrogen. We'll get to those. The EU is betting big on these gases to help reach climate neutrality and net zero emissions by 2050. But there are still a lot of questions to be resolved. How do we make sure it's really green? How will it be used? How long will it take? How much will it cost? And most importantly, at least for today's sponsors, will it actually flow through today's gas grids? Or will the existing pipes be left empty and abandoned on the cold march to a brave new climate-neutral world? Tell us what you think. Send in your questions using the Slido app, or if you're watching from our website, there should be an entry form below the video screen. You can also tweet using the hashtag #GreenGasFuture, and you can feel free to test it out now by participating in our poll. What is the most difficult challenge gas distribution grids will face on the path to net zero? With this, I ask you to welcome our sponsor, Gas Distributors for Sustainability, represented today by the CEO of Italgas, Paolo Gallo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor, and welcome to all the persons that are connected today. I will briefly introduce, first of all, GD4S for those of you who do not know it. GD4S is an association that gathering about seven major gas-only distributor network in Europe, representing about 30% of the market and delivering around 27 billion cubic meter of natural gas, covering 300,000 kilometers of network. But I would like to move to the central part of my speech and answer to the question, what's the future of gas grid in a climate neutral European Union? And I will respond also using this slide that you see, but I will respond starting saying gas grid will continue to play an important role in the energy future supply for European citizens and industry, securing the energy transition. If we look at the chart that is on scene, let me start saying that with the surge of biomethane availability in this decade and hydrogen in the next decade, gas infrastructure will become essential to accommodate renewable and green gases. Furthermore, gas grids will be essential for energy system integration, providing storage and flexibility that is required by an energy system that more and more is based on renewable. In fact, if we think that the majority of the coal and nuclear power plants that will be phased out in the next year will be replaced by renewable production, we will see an increase of the rigidity of the system on one side, and from the other side, an increase of energy surplus. Today, the only affordable and largely available way we can leverage to provide flexibility to the system is the energy storage that gas infrastructure can allow. The concept of the power to gas that you see on the top part of the chart that in respect to the traditional way of the energy storage, provide a dual dimension, time and space, to release the energy that is stored from renewable production surplus. Already today, gas accounts for more than 60% of the European energy need, providing in the same time a significant flexibility to the system. It is a clear demonstration of the crucial role gas infrastructure will play in the future. But the gas infrastructure and the gas system will not remain important only for the role relevant to the energy storage and the flexibility that I have just described. It is also important because the growing amount of renewable gas available will ensure a significant zero-emission energy source, which already has a number of immediate applications. Let me mention a couple of them. Heating and conditioning, such as hybrid heat pumps, and mobility, such as light and heavy vehicles. Both examples do not require any change in citizen and customer habits, are available immediately. But to exercise such role, gas infrastructure shall become truly digital. Digitization is the enabler of different uses of gas infrastructure, of different uses of gas inside the infrastructure. It will help increase efficiency. It will allow integration of different types of gases. It will improve the resilience of the network. It will support the sector integration, both in terms of supply and demand. More specifically, I see the digitization process as a technical precondition for feeding renewable gases such as hydrogen and biomethane into distribution networks. Digitization will create a new generation of infrastructure equipped to be remotely controlled, to be monitored on a constant way, in order to understand what flows inside the infrastructure, how it flows, the pressure level, the amount of authorization needed, and so on. But digitization will become also a fundamental tool to reduce the methane emission. That you know very well, methane emission is a central subject of the European Commission agenda. Curbing methane emission in the gas distribution system is indeed a challenging, but no longer the liable task, as clearly stated recently by the communication on methane strategy by the European Commission. The only way to detect, control, and reduce methane emission is leveraging the digital transformation of the gas distribution networks. To conclude, I am truly convinced that final customer will enjoy a more efficient, reliable, resilient, and sustainable energy supply. And this will ultimately be the real driver to preserve the role of the gas distribution grids on a long-term basis. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Gallo. And just to briefly introduce the speakers that we have with us today, I'm joined by Ulrich Benterbusch, Deputy Director General, of Germany's Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. Florian Ermacora, Head of Unit for Wholesale Markets, Electricity and Gas at DG Ener. We have Ms. Federica Sabbati, Secretary General of the European Heating Industry, and Anna Serdoner, Industrial Policy Manager at Bellona Europe. We also will be having as a special pop-up guest Dennis Hesseling, Head of the Gas Department at the EU Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators. Thank you all for joining me. And just to set the scene a little, I wanted to put a few numbers out there. Last year, in 2019, the EU spent nearly 70 billion euros on importing natural gas, mostly from Russia, Norway, Qatar, Algeria. So it's a big packet of money we're talking about when we are imagining weaning ourselves off of energy imports, reinvesting that money back home, and to top it all off on gases that emit no CO2. Some would say it's even too good to be true. On the issue of making sure these green gases are really green, I'd like to start by going to Ms. Serdoner. Your organization has sounded the alarm repeatedly this year over how the Commission is proposing to certify gases as renewable. You initially look at it, it sounds like it's a pretty good thing. These gases have to have a 70% greenhouse gas emission savings compared to fossil fuels. Where is the danger?
Well, I would say that the danger is in overestimating the potential supply of these fuels that we would have. Essentially, what we want to do is set environmental criteria and sustainability criteria that reflect actual emissions to the atmosphere. So both indirect and direct emissions of the production of these fuels and the combustion of these fuels must be counted in order for us to have a good idea of what is actually happening in reality. So since all of these fuels that we are currently talking about, no matter what goes into this category of green gases, so sustainable biomethane, for example, or synthetic fuels, e-fuels, hydrogen, ammonia even as well, all of these fuels require significant resources to produce. And therefore, we need set environmental criteria and really clear definitions in order to control their deployment and make sure that they are actually reducing emissions along the way. And these kind of criteria should be determined prior to their large-scale deployment.
Now, I recall reading some of your policy papers, and it sounded like you didn't think this was happening. I believe I recall the magic with numbers expression coming up. Could you tell us a little bit about whether you think the current formulas are being rigid enough for the green? And with that, I would like to take it over once you give a brief answer to Mr. Ermacora.
Yeah, so currently we are involved in the stakeholder consultations in the Renewable Energy Directive process, where within a delegated act, this methodology is being determined. So what is important here is to reflect the actual key criteria that were determined in the Renewable Energy Directive itself already, which is the additionality of the renewable electricity used for the production of the hydrogen or the synthetic fuels in question, and the temporal and geographic connection between the production of these fuels and the generation of the renewable electricity. In that way, we can make sure that these fuels are actually reducing emissions and are low carbon and are complying with the target that you mentioned earlier.
Now, before I do throw that to Mr. Ermacora, just for the listeners at home who may not be familiar with these, when we talk about additionality principle, please, if I'm wrong on this, Mr. Ermacora, feel free to clarify, but we're talking about making sure that there is more renewable installations that are going toward the production of this. And when we're talking about the emissions that are going into producing these, it's the concern that if we've got a big electrolyzer machine that's giving a little jolt to some water, when we've got the H's and the O's separating, it's clean, but it's only as clean as the electricity going into the machine. So there is a big concern that in certain countries, potentially Germany, we'll get to that later, that have a high proportion of coal or natural gas in their electricity mix, may not be making an electricity-based hydrogen that is as clean as we would hope. Mr. Ermacora, would you have something to say about the way that the Commission is calculating these formulas to keep these green gases green?
I wouldn't be able to give you details on the calculations at this stage, but that's not the issue. The issue is, and this we have sketched out in the hydrogen strategy, that if we want to go green and promote green hydrogen and other green gases, then we need to be clear on the definition what is really green, and that's why when we look at our legislative program for next year, we will have to work more on definitions, on a guarantee of the origin, on certificates, in the context of a revision of the Renewables Directive. So that's in the work program for mid-next year.
So would you say that there is one overarching challenge that you see looming ahead, let's say, in the next 6 months to a year?
In the area of decarbonized gases? The challenge is to get get a promotion of green and decarbonized gases. We know how important gaseous fuels will be in the future. They're already today, and they will be also important in the future. And those gaseous fuels need to be green and decarbonized if we want to achieve the long-term 2050 objective of climate neutrality. From that point of view, we need to promote by all means the production and consumption of green gases. We need to be clear, as I just mentioned, on the definitions. We need to come forward with a regulatory framework at EU level which is conducive for the establishment of infrastructure to get those decarbonized or green gases from their production to the consumption. These are key issues when we look at the regulatory framework. There's a lot of action ongoing already now. We have formed the so-called Hydrogen Alliance to get the stakeholders together. We have a number of research projects. We are promoting pilot projects and so on, but we also need to look at the regulatory long-term frame to promote these gases.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go over to Mr. Benterbusch as a representative of Germany's hydrogen coordination project. Now, Peter Altmaier earlier this summer said he wanted Germany to be #1 in the field of hydrogen. I think that one question that jumps to my mind is, with Germany's electricity mix so dependent on coal and on natural gas, is that a good idea? And how do we balance the long-term desire to have this green hydrogen while taking into account what Mr. Ermacora said, getting the market going and maybe accepting that to ramp up, it may not be as green as we like?
Well, we have clearly said, and this is absolutely true for my minister, that we want to have 5 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity installed by 2030 on national soil, onshore or offshore, and that is our target. We are open to import more quantities of green gases if needed, in particular for our industry, if by 2030 there is a respective demand in our market. And in particular, with regard to the longer-term perspective, we have made it very, very clear in our strategy that Germany will remain a large importer of green molecules. Our industry, chemical industry, steel industry, the transport sector, will not be able to decarbonize without the import of these green gaseous molecules. That's absolutely clear for us. Power to X, power to liquid will also be important. If we see, for example, the ambitious targets that we have set for the transport sector, and we calculate how we would like to reach these targets, in particular in conjunction with the implementation of the RED II, then it becomes very apparent that in our case, the target can't be 14% of renewable energies in the transport sector. We need to significantly top this up, because otherwise the sectoral targets for the transport sector will not be reached. And we cannot end up with legislation where at this point in time we decide on something which clearly indicates that this country, that this economy will not be able to reach, for example, its CO2 reduction targets in the transport sector. This all will have a big impact on hydrogen production, on CO2 neutral hydrogen production, on green hydrogen production. And it is absolutely clear that on the northern hemisphere, in a geographical situation like Germany, there is only so much renewable energy that we can produce. And since we have important targets for the electricity sector, as my colleague Florian has just said, it's absolutely necessary that we have a good implementation of this principle of additionality, because it can't be that on the one hand we start to produce green gases, in particular green hydrogen, via an electrolyzer, and at the end of the merit order we use then additional brown coal in order to satisfy the demand of the electricity sector. That's of course impossible. There is of course in the short term a conflict of target in my view, because for the first projects that we may be able to initialize next year, we may not have the respective regulation from Brussels regarding the green, the definition of green electricity to be used to produce green hydrogen. And I think here we need a little bit more flexibility, because the question of who is able to speed this development up, the production of electrolyzers and all the technology, is a question of global scale. And here we are in competition with other important players. And therefore, our idea is that for the first projects, we need to be a bit more flexible with regard to the definition of what is green, because we can't, for these projects, it can only be what is in the grid. I mean, otherwise they probably cannot produce green hydrogen. But that can only be true for the first 2-3 projects. Once the regulation is there, we have to follow it, and that's important.
Thank you for that, Mr. Benterbusch. Some quite interesting points, if I had my ears correctly tuned to that. We want green to be green, but maybe for the first 2-3 projects, green doesn't necessarily need to be as green as we would hope. We'll get to that, but I want to loop in now Mr. Dennis Hesseling from the ACER, Community of Regulators. On this point, we talk a lot about regulation, we talk a lot about the need to get the framework right to make sure that with one foot in the electricity world, with one foot in the gas world, this hydrogen regulatory decisions make sense. To you, what are the biggest sort of specific challenges coming on the horizon on this front?
I think I mentioned 2 here. One links to what Florian Ermacora already said about how the market framework is set up in terms of regulation. You mentioned, America, in the beginning, this 70 billion euros that the EU spends on gas at this moment or last year to import them. That was the import bill. This import bill was 29 billion euros lower than the year before. And that's because we have a pretty well-functioning gas market inside Europe based on natural gas at this moment. And it shows you how incredibly important the benefits of good competition can be when it comes to market integration, not having barriers between member states, and having really competition driving down the prices. Now, the energy transition is going to be expensive, but we're trying to organize it in such a way that it's done at least cost. And that means, in our view, that we should take all the successful elements from the current gas regulation, the way the European gas market is organized, and keep them as much as possible for the future way in which we regulate the hydrogen market. That's the one thing. The second thing is about the investments, because we will need some investments to get from where we are now, where we have natural gas accounting for about 40% of the EU's primary energy consumption, to a situation with decarbonized gases, more electrification, and probably also quite a significant role for hydrogen. And that requires certain investments. I think there we are working under a regulatory framework, which is the so-called 10E regulation, where there's quite a big role for industry, for the electricity and gas transmission companies. In our view, you need a more neutral actor to have a proper governance in place to make sure that really what is invested in, especially with European subsidies, with European taxpayers' money, is done in the public interest. And we think there the Commission has a chance now with the upcoming revision of this 10E regulation to improve the governance there.
Indeed, a little bird told me that a few early drafts of the 10E regulation show potentially no natural gas section, potentially a special hydrogen section. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, but I'd like to now turn to Ms. Sabbati from the European heating industry. Now, I'm very excited to have you here, not only because your organization is facilitating one of the Hydrogen Alliance roundtables, but also because it would seem that when we talk about heating appliances, you're not necessarily all hydrogen gas, if I understand correctly. You guys have hybrid models, heat pumps, electric. So if you would perhaps tell me whether your members see the trend going one way or another, or whether indeed the technology is ready from a sort of residential appliance point of view to be rolled out if hydrogen were ready tomorrow in all the volumes we had needed.
Yeah, the building sector is very interested in this debate. We're a little bit at the end of what the colleagues just now have been talking about, but this is where really this comes alive, I think, for all the consumers. Our members are indeed manufacturers of heating systems, and they produce all sorts of technologies that work both with electricity, like heat pumps, hybrids, and but also, of course, gas, condensing technologies, solar thermal, and so on. So we try to have a look at it from a broader perspective than just one technology. And clearly we see that in the future for buildings, there's going to be a higher share of electrification. So there's going to be much more heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps entering the market in comparison to today, as much as electricity becomes renewable as well. But we see also from different studies that have been put out, not necessarily by us, but from NSOG itself to the European Commission and even the electricity sector, that electricity is not going to be able to do it all in 2050 for buildings. So there's going to be still a big share of buildings that need to be decarbonized, and therefore green gases are for us a very interesting possibility to decarbonize this large sector. And we think that this combination of electricity or green gases, including hydrogen, together with solar thermal, biomass, these are all part of a puzzle that will make the 2050 decarbonization goal possible. So there is, I'm afraid, no single solution, but certainly green gases is one that we are seeing growing as an opportunity to do what electricity alone cannot do for 2050.
So do you imagine a scenario then where everybody will have both options in their home, or is it more maybe a question of geographical separation in terms of who heats their home with electricity, who heats their home with some green gas?
Well, Europe is very different. This is also the nice part of it. So you don't have a clear separation, urban, rural, or north-south. It's unfortunately more complex than this, but there's going to be different solutions for different environments. So if you are, in a little house in the countryside, off-grid, then you probably will have one solution. If you are connected to the gas grid that will be adapted, then you will probably have either a hybrid or you will have a gas boiler. If you are in the mountains, you might probably have a biomass boiler. So there's really different options per different buildings. I remember that Europe has, and this is also the challenge for the decarbonization of buildings. You have very different type of buildings, different climate zones, different infrastructure in terms of energy. You also have different consumer preferences. Yeah, you simply have the role of the consumer in there, and also different financial means for the renovation. And not all of these technologies are available for everybody, both for technical reasons, but also for financial reasons, for example.
Thank you. Now, going over to Mr. Ermacora, last week we heard Kadri Simpson at the EU Hydrogen Week say that if Europe is the body, hydrogen is the blood flowing through the arteries, which sounds like quite a push for reconverting the gas grid. My question to you is twofold. One, will we actually be seeing this full artery network of hydrogen going across the EU? Or will it rather be, as some have said, sort of closed networks of hydrogen or green gas pipelines here and there with a largely electric future?
Okay, I don't have the crystal ball with me to be definite on these issues, and we have to see how the developments are. We know that for the moment hydrogen is used in very specific circumstances at the local level, where you have production in clusters, and then also consumption in clusters. In the future, it depends, of course, very much on how hydrogen and green hydrogen will be used. Where is it really needed to decarbonize our society, our economy? as we see things, clear priority for reasons of effectiveness and efficiency when it comes to decarbonization is the electrification. But not all industry sectors, no, not all sectors of our economy could be electrified and decarbonized through wind and sun in electricity. So they're hard to electrify or difficult or impossible to electrify sectors may need hydrogen, green hydrogen for decarbonization. I'm thinking here of certain producing industries like steel industry, glass industry. I'm thinking here of certain parts of the transport sector which you cannot electrify. So if the uses of green hydrogen are rather specific, then it is difficult to imagine that we will have in the future a hydrogen network as we have the gas network today. It could be much more specific that over time you have some pipelines transporting hydrogen, which by the way could be also transported through other means, going to some few large installations and not to households. So this would make quite a difference in terms of the dimensioning of the grid. So that's what we would see for the moment, that you start off with hydrogen clusters, and at a certain stage you link them. You will have some cross-border pipelines through which you transport hydrogen. You will have some sort, we buy into this theory, some sort of hydrogen backbone in Europe in terms of pipelines. But I doubt that we have a system which really looks like the natural gas system today.
Thank you. And interesting to hear you mention the words hydrogen backbone. I understand that it was ENSOG, about a dozen of the gas transmission system operators this year put out a report called Hydrogen Backbone, in which they claimed that over the next 20 years, they could quite cheaply do just that. But I'd like to throw to Ms. Serdoner here, because it sounds like from what you were saying at the beginning, there's going to be quite a limited amount of these sustainable gases, and it didn't sound like you thought we should be piping it into everybody's homes.
Yes, well, at least in the near future, we don't expect a very large amount of these gases to be readily available for each and every sector. So as Mr. Ermacora already said, green electrons are still the best way to decarbonize in most sectors. And where that direct electrification is not possible, in those sectors, we can use hydrogen. So heavy industry is one example that he mentioned as well. So the steel industry, there are some really interesting projects, for example, in replacing hydrogen for ammonia, fertilizer production. So in very specific targeted areas, we could use it, but we don't expect to have a very large rollout in the coming years. I believe it was also mentioned by Mr. Benterbusch that it will be difficult to scale up, at least in the coming years. And yes, we would encourage everyone to still stay with the real definition of green gases and have all of the emissions counted. Because if we don't get this from the start, we are risking going into a situation similar to biofuels, where we're not predicting the indirect impacts of the production of the fuel from the start. And that is what we need to be aware of.
Thank you for that. I'd like to go over to Mr. Benterbusch. What do you make of all this? I'd be curious to hear, in the few German hydrogen projects that you alluded to, whether you see things that are tending more towards this sort of closed circuit situations in terms of pipeline, or whether the ambition is really to connect every car, plane, and home to a green gas grid.
Well, that is certainly not the ambition, in particular not in the short run. For us, it is absolutely clear that the key area is the refineries at the beginning, because here, if we replace the grey hydrogen used in our refineries today through green hydrogen, then the cost of this is carried over to the transport sector, so to the consumers who buy their diesel or gasoline at the station. And this is then done without any subsidies. In Germany, this is around about 2 gigawatts of capacity for electrolyzers, and that's already a big boost to the market. In addition, our government has earmarked 7 billion euros for other projects that are either in the transport sector or in industry or in the heating sector. And we are going to develop criteria how to select these projects. And this is an important part of the equation, because if we are not able to scale up the production of green hydrogen in the short term, also in Europe, we will lose competitive advantages that we today have. And since we are sure that without hydrogen, we will not be able to reach and realize climate neutrality by 2050, it is now clear that in the next 10 years, we have to develop our hydrogen capacity in terms of production, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of use in a specific sector, in order to set the basis for being competitive at a global scale. It is also important not only to increase the cooperation among European countries. Here, the important projects of common European interests are decisive to develop and speed up the development for the production of green hydrogen, transport and use, because it is only through cooperation within Europe that we can lift the total potential that is there, and this potential is already huge. But we are convinced that in addition, a highly developed energy-intensive economy like Germany, who imports today around about 85% of its energy, will also have to develop supply chains to partner countries outside of Europe in order to make sure that we get the necessary green molecules in the future that are needed. This all will take time, but to start with it, we have to do it now in the next 1, 2, 3 years, because in Japan, in US, in other areas, China, they are all heading in the same direction, because they have all realized that green electricity and efficiency, that's the backbone of any energy transition. But without green molecules, you can't do it, because either you need it as a feedstock or as here and there energy carrier. There's no way.
Thank you so much, Mr. Benterbusch. I'd like to throw back to Mr. Ermacora. We're hearing a lot about the green molecules, about the lack of sufficient volumes in the short term. Some people were not surprised, but other people were surprised to see that the EU hydrogen strategy didn't seem to be very open to nuclear electricity being able to participate in the game, despite the fact that that was the case. We've seen that France has said it's ready to go forward and use its nuclear fleet to make what it called low carbon or zero carbon nuclear. And I'm curious as to whether there's a reason for that, given that the taxonomy, which will be regulating sort of private investments into the market, also don't have nuclear in there, and yet it seems to be potentially a solution to ramp up those zero carbon volumes of the green molecules.
That's a tricky issue and a tricky question you can put to an EU official, because there's the understanding also based on law that the energy mix of our member states is their prerogative. It is not up to the EU to decide whether you produce your electricity from nuclear or from water or from anything else. That's the principle. On the other hand, you have seen over the last decade that the EU is promoting green electricity, green energy. We have targets there. And that's well acknowledged. That's a sort of intrusion into this energy mix competence of the member states. And you can expect policies which will continue like this. We have promoted green electricity, and I guess I'm not going too far by saying that you can expect some promotion measures for green hydrogen as well. This does not exclude that member states produce hydrogen in other ways as well, but they need then to comply with any possible more concrete objectives, be it for production or consumption, which is targeting green hydrogen. So there's a clear priority, which you see already from the hydrogen strategy on green hydrogen, but by no means member states are prevented for going in addition to other ways of producing hydrogen, which could be through nuclear as well.
It's interesting because I recall the EU hydrogen strategy, and I remember that while there were drafts that spoke in colors, right, green, blue, et cetera, to my recollection, the final version went for a standard of CO2 in it, which presumably would be slightly more favorable to nuclear-powered hydrogen if it was low on CO2 emissions. However, one of the questions here that we have submitted asks, does the fact that the taxonomy currently doesn't have nuclear hinder this energy transition and then the proliferation of this low-carbon hydrogen?
It may not promote it. Whether it actually hinders, I don't know, but it boils down to the issue which I mentioned. We will try to promote from the EU side green projects, both for electricity and for hydrogen. This could be subsidies, support from EU funds, which would then be directed into this direction, and this could be, but it's will be subject to a big policy discussion, promotion through regulatory targets of green hydrogen, which does not prevent member states from, in addition, going for other means of producing hydrogen as well.
Okay, I'd like to pull out a few more questions from the submissions. How to make sure that bringing sustainable gas into the market will not come at a high cost for consumers, as it was the case for renewable electricity. Perhaps Mr. Hesseling has something to say on this.
We need to make sure that we can keep the cost as low as possible. I think one of the things that was difficult in the beginning with renewable electricity is that there were fixed subsidy schemes which went on probably for a bit too long with hindsight. And once we had the system of getting more auctions in, where there was competition between those offering renewable electricity, the prices went down significantly, together, of course, with the cost curve going down overall. And I think we should learn from that when it comes to promoting renewable gases, to make sure that, yes, in the beginning, you may need some additional measures for, let's say, the R&D phase, the pilot projects that we see developing now. That's a separate way. But once you get to, let's say, more possibilities, to make sure that there is more competition between those different ways of producing renewable gases, and let them compete. Let's get the most decarbonization value for EU taxpayers' money.
And while I have you, you mentioned earlier this question of who gets to decide when the pipelines begin to take different gases. And if you could maybe elaborate a little on why you think perhaps the Commission may not be best placed to do so, and if so, is the community of regulators the people who decide, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not so skeptical about the Commission, actually. The Commission is a public institution, and they take the public interest at heart. What I was pointing to is that at the moment, there's a number of processes in place where the industry has quite a big role. And when I say industry, I mean the electricity and gas transmission companies. They have quite a central role, for instance, when it comes to designing scenarios. And scenarios are the ones which are the basic elements to later on make the assessment for which projects could benefit from EU subsidies. And now these scenarios, of course, they sound very technical and they're very detailed and they require a lot of technical knowledge, but they also point in a certain direction. And it depends quite a lot if you take, for instance, energy efficiency into account or demand-side response, or if your basic assumption is that the main way to address any issue would be to build a new pipeline or a new transmission line. Those are the kind of things that I'm pointing to. For the moment, I think the governance there is also seen by many stakeholders as not particularly balanced. And I think the Commission, that's where it comes to them, has a chance now with this revision of the 10E regulation to address it and to improve the governance.
Does that mean you're in favor of natural gas projects no longer having a place in the 10E revision?
No, what I'm in favor of is that the overall governance becomes more neutral, so there's no bias, let's say, towards any particular industry. There are clear standards for sustainability which apply across the board, and then in the end that the projects can compete. And maybe in the beginning there could be a few natural gas projects in there. I wouldn't expect much. And over time, of course, this should go down. And maybe some of them will be replaced by hydrogen projects, by power to gas projects, by green gases, and others maybe will be taken over by electrification. But we have to ensure, I think, at European level, that the process is neutral, that is objective, that is transparent, and that over time it can accommodate any new technologies coming to the market.
Now, in the position of regulator, do you have perhaps a bird's eye view that can give us an idea when we might practically see, let's say, blending requirements coming in? When will that be technically feasible for hydrogen, for other gases in the grid?
Yeah, I think it needs to come soon, but we're quite far away yet. We did a survey of the national regulators just a few months ago, and they pointed out that at the moment, about 3/4 of the national gas transmission systems do not allow hydrogen to be injected into the gas grid. And some speakers already mentioned the difficulties of starting up the whole process. In the beginning, we will have very few dedicated hydrogen pipelines. So in the beginning, when you produce hydrogen, if you don't use it on the site, you'll probably have to inject it into the current natural gas grid just to get into the higher volumes. That's something that the transmission companies need to allow, and also that you need to allow that there's cross-border trade possible, so that it doesn't become a barrier to trade, that you keep the competition to keep the prices as low as possible. And that's something where I think we need European action to make sure this becomes feasible in the, let's say, relatively short term.
Thank you so much. And we've got a question coming in from Cogen Europe. Ooh, not that one. I'm going to start with another question. Apologies, Cogen Europe. From an anonymous Philip, when do you expect the first conversion of hydrogen-ready appliances in the residential sector from natural gas to 100% hydrogen? I think that's for Ms. Sabbati.
Yeah, well, the good news is that we are already able to work with blends of hydrogen. Our appliances, the new appliances that you put on the market today, like condensing boilers, are already taking up to 20% of hydrogen. So if there was indeed, the possibility of using it, we could be using it already now. And that's a message for those producing it and potentially distributing it. We think we are already working on the 100% hydrogen technologies. One is already available, that's fuel cells, and the other one is simply 100% hydrogen boilers. We think that in the next 10 years, they will probably be available in the market. We have at the moment several field test projects in different parts of Europe. So it's something that we've already been investing in, and we see it as a real development for the sector. So, we need to break a little bit that chicken and egg discussion whereby, there's no hydrogen, therefore there's no appliances, there's no appliances, therefore there's no hydrogen. The appliances are there, so let's pipe in the hydrogen.
All right, I think that we heard that loud and clear. The appliances are ready to go, just waiting for those regulatory barriers to be lifted. One for Mr. Benterbusch. When will Germany launch the IPCEI on hydrogen? Which other countries will be on board? And for those who are not aware, IPCEI, important project of common European interest, projects to be fast-tracked and funded with EU money. Mr. Benterbusch, when can we expect an IPCEI from hydrogen, from Germany?
Well, we will launch the phase where you can send us the project proposals that is planned for early December and up until I think the end of January. So lots of work over Christmas and New Year for those who are developing these projects. Sorry to say, but I'm aware that in a lot of offices, they are already preparing exactly these proposals. So I hope that Christmas will not suffer too much concerning this kind of timeline. And then we will sit down and have to, evaluate the proposals. And I do hope that in the course of the next year, we will be able to come up with a decision together then, of course, with our European partners. And the Commission, at least we will put a lot of effort into it, that we speed up this development as fast as we can, because we are here, as I said already, in a competition with other spots on our planet.
Thank you very much. Now, I see a double question from anonymous sources for Mr. Ermacora. Should hydrogen have its own regulatory category, or should it be lumped together with all the other sustainable gases? And what provisions should be included in the next 10E regulation to ensure full consistency with Green Deal objectives?
That's maybe too early to answer the question whether we need a specific hydrogen regulation or whether we cannot deal with integrating also from the regulatory point of view, decarbonized gases into the existing natural gas framework. I think both options are possible. I don't want to prejudge this yet. We'll have quite some discussions over the next year, also with public consultations, and need to look at all pros and cons. But it's clear that we need some regulatory frame also for hydrogen. For 10E, Dennis has sketched out quite well what needs to be done in terms of sustainability criteria for promoting projects of common interest, and for defining certain projects as projects of common interest. And in any case, this needs to be opened to hydrogen projects. And what we also need to do, and I think that's something both the 10E regulation may need to look further into, or the future next year gas decarbonization regulation, are the common planning issues. You cannot, with our sector integration strategy, continue to plan your own electricity world, and then you have your own gas world, and then you have your own heat world and the hydrogen world. This is not useful. You need to bring all these sectors, energy sectors, together and have them one comprehensive planning. And this is not only true for the European level, but this should be true also for the national level.
Now, just to clarify, would you be willing to say whether the upcoming 10E revision will or will not have a hydrogen category, will or will not have a natural gas category?
Those consultations, internal consultations, are still ongoing. So I can't tell you what will be in the final proposal. But if you look at our sector integration strategy and our hydrogen strategy, then it's quite clear that sector integration starts with the infrastructure categories and infrastructure planning.
Well, I mean, the EU Ombudsman recently pretty much slammed the Commission for approving about 7 years' worth of natural gas projects without taking into account sufficiently the sustainability criteria. And one of the reasons that it gave for not delving further is by saying, you know, the Commission has promised in its upcoming revision of 10E that it will look closer at this. So can you give our listeners at home maybe some indication that this is actually be taken seriously, if you're not willing to say whether or not natural gas is going to be given the boot?
Can I tell you that this is taken seriously? That's very logical to look into this and look at the importance of natural gas projects and decarbonized gas projects. That's for sure that this needs to be taken into account. As Dennis said, further look into the sustainability criteria, which are decisive for qualifying something as a project of common interest. It's normal that we are looking into this.
All right, I appreciate your response. And so we only have a few minutes left. I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. There was agreement that we need to have those green criteria really be green, though some wavering even from Germany's category, saying, well, maybe for the first few projects, you know, we need to be a little more flexible. The residential heating appliances are ready to go if and when the volumes are there, and everybody is waiting to see how it will be regulated, but it may take time. Nobody has given us some hard years yet. I'd like to go to each one of you and ask if there were just one thing you'd like to see happen in the first quarter of next year to move the ball forward on green gases, what would it be? And I'd like to start with Mr. Ermacora.
Next quarter, first quarter of next year, this is a very limited time span. I can just hope that the Hydrogen Alliance at European level gets the stakeholders together, both for pilot projects and for planning the sort of bigger infrastructure which we need over the next decades.
Okay, over to Ms. Serdoner. What would you like to see for the next quarter?
Well, there is quite a few things on my wish list, but if I could choose, it would be a good definition of what green gases are, and how we measure their climate impact, reflecting the actual emissions or emissions reductions in reality. And hopefully transition that is focused more on the actual climate impacts and climate goals rather than maintaining certain gas infrastructure interests or volumes at place.
Ms. Sabbati, what would you like to see in the next quarter, the first quarter of next year?
So the priority for the building sector is to really replace all the inefficient heating appliances that are today in each of our homes. If we don't do that faster than we do it today, we will not be able to have the new technologies that take on green gases. So I think the barrier number one to be broken down tomorrow is to really replace those old heaters faster than we do today. That means faster than the 4% target that the European Commission has just published in the renovation wave.
Mr. Benterbusch, what would you like to see by the beginning of next year happen to move things forward?
Actually, I'd like to see two things. First thing is that we have a national regulation on the transition regime for the infrastructure, so that we can really, before already Europe has come up with a big regulation, start hydrogen projects. Because without any transition regulation, nobody will invest because they need security, even the first projects. And secondly, of course, an ambition, an implementation of the RED II in the transport sector with a very ambitious target concerning renewable energies, which implies enough space for hydrogen in the transport sector in the next coming 10 years.
Mr. Hesseling, what would you like to see happen in Q1 2021?
Yeah, for Q1 next year, I would actually look forward to the proposals from the European Commission on updating the gas legislation, and in particular to see if they manage, as I would expect them to do, to significantly increase the importance of the sustainability aspect to make sure we move clearly towards decarbonization, while keeping all the benefits that we have seen from competitive and integrated energy markets.
Now, you'll forgive me for asking, but in layman's terms, what do you mean?
I mean that we get more attention for sustainability, so more regimes which are friendly for renewable gases, both the existing ones and also the new ones coming in, like hydrogen, while we make sure there's no barriers between the member states. At the moment, we have competition at European level. If you don't watch out, you get national incentive regimes, which means you could do something in Germany, but you can't do it in France or in Austria. We need to make sure that those borders remain open so that there is real competition between all those different providers of renewable gases and that the consumers get the best price for these new gases coming in.
Okay. Now, a few more questions are coming in. We still have a bit of time, and I believe we haven't yet seen the results of our poll. So if it would be possible to see the results of the poll sometime in the next few minutes. Okay, yes. We had 82 people respond to the question, what is the most difficult challenge for gas distribution grids along the path to carbon neutrality in 2050? And it looks like 35% chose forthcoming legislation, regulation, example, the taxonomy. Not a big surprise there. It's been kind of dominating the talk today. Gas quality issues when dealing with blending natural gas, biomethane, and hydrogen. That was in second place. A full 17% of people said none of the above. Gas grids will have no role in 2050. I don't know how that makes everybody feel on the panel, because gas will be substituted by other vectors. And then down below, methane emissions, capability to accomplish grid modernization and digitalization. I'd like to throw a sort of random question in there that we haven't addressed, the explosive sort of danger, potentially, of hydrogen installations if we're injecting it in the gas network, if somebody's residential appliance or car just goes boom. Who would be the person who would be fired? I mean, who would that be, the national level? Would that be the EU level? Is this something that we're underestimating? I don't know if that would go to the residential appliances, or that would go to the Commission, if anybody wants to jump in on this one.
This would be very unusual that for such a safety question, a Commission official is fired. So I feel quite comfortable here. No, that these safety issues and safety standards, that's well rooted in the national competence, and then you can come together at European level to see some harmonization. but it's not the EU official, the first target of such complaint or competence.
So you punt to Mr. Benterbusch, in other words, the German representative. Something explodes, his head.
Well, that's of course an issue that we are taking very serious. We have from the past the experience of the so-called Stadtgas, in particular in the Ruhrgebiet area, where we already had in our gas grid up to 50% of hydrogen for decades, and it was very safe. So it shows we can handle it. But of course, the devil is in the detail, and therefore we have specialized institutions working already today on these questions, how to make sure that the safety standards are in place and that it works. And of course also a worst case scenario where something happens, to make sure that public discussion does not get out of control and that we lose the public support for this important innovation wave that will sweep through Europe via our gas grids.
All right. Well, one last question, and I feel a little bad in my role that I maybe didn't address this earlier. Somebody asks, what does the term green gas actually mean? Now, I know we've addressed maybe there's not a definition enough yet, but perhaps Ms. Serdoner could enlighten us for those just coming in. What do we mean when we talk about green gases?
Well, that depends whether who you ask. So I believe, as far as I remember, in the 10-year network development plans of the NSOG, biomethane and hydrogen and synthetic methane were the most prominent gases that were mentioned. Now, that will depend on their definition, but yeah, hopefully they are defined according to their climate impact. So I would like to think that the methodology that is being currently formulated within the RED process will reflect their sustainability, and then they will receive either the title of a green gas or a high carbon gas.
So a green gas is a clean gas that burns and doesn't hurt the planet. I think that would be a nice, simple way to put it if our friends at the Commission stick to the green principles. And with that, it looks like we're out of time. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching this event wherever you are. I'd like to thank my panelists, Mr. Benterbusch, Mr. Ermacora, Ms. Sabbati, Ms. Serdoner, and Mr. Hesseling for participating today. Thanks again to our sponsor, Gas Distributors for Sustainability. And please, this is an extension of our journalism. I am the hydrogen reporter. If there are questions we didn't get to, if there are things we should be covering, send me an email. I am always willing to pick up the phone, hear what people are saying, and write a story. And with that, thank you very much.